Hello everyone, welcome to part 8 of manual software testing interview questions, and in this video I'm going to cover another 10 very important questions which are listed on the screen here. So we'll cover what is test implementation. So in the last video we have covered the test development process, right? So if we go back, let me go back and show you so that you can understand that in continuation. So we have covered the test development process, right? And in the part 7 we have covered the test analysis and design. Now let's see what is test implementation if the question arises in your interviews. Okay, so we are going to cover test implementation, then we are going to cover what are some of the test design technique. We'll go back to the test design technique. We'll understand about the specification based or black box test design technique. We'll understand about the structure based. We'll understand about the experience based, what is equivalence, partitioning, boundary value analysis, and why both are required. Then what is decision table and state transition testing. Now any of these questions can be asked in any order in your interview, right? So you need to be basically prepared and know what to tell with examples. So I'm going to cover all of those details that you need to tell in the interview whenever you are facing the software testing interview with examples, so that you can easily answer these sort of questions. Okay, so let's go back and understand the 71st question. What is test implementation, right? So test implementation is nothing but it is in test implementation, test cases are grouped into test suites, okay, and ordered into a proper sequence. Now not necessarily whatever test conditions or scenarios you have written, right? So for example, you have identified a test condition. Now that condition will test in a very specific part of that particular module. Okay, now in order to test a logical sequence or the business flow, you need to make sure that the test cases are grouped into, or a sequence is made. So for example, login test case will enable you to log in, and then after logging, say for example, you are trying to test the cart, right? So what is the precondition? What steps you need to follow? You need to first log in, and then you need to add the items into the cart. You need to follow steps to add the items into the cart in an e-commerce website. So in the test implementation, you come up with that logical test suites, and then you also formulate a proper sequence. For example, for a functional testing, what sort of suite you are going to cover, what for regression testing, what you are going to do. Okay, so all of that is going to be part of the implementation. So if you have written all the relevant test cases, then you add those into different test suites. Okay, you create a test suite or basically a set, and within that you add that yes, these are the test cases that we are going to execute as part of the regression cycle, right? So all of that activity comes into the implementation. In the implementation, you specify a test procedure. Okay, and test procedure is nothing but a document which specifies the steps to be taken in running set of test cases. Okay, so test procedure, as procedure word itself is there, so what process or procedure you are going to follow in order to run a particular business test. Okay, for example, login is an individual module test, right? But in order to test the whole flow, there will be a complete procedure, right? So in order to test adding item to the cart or removing item to the cart, you need a combination of multiple test cases, right? So you need to have a procedure of the test cases, and that is also what you basically do. And mostly you don't go into that sort of detailed documentation, creating those Word documents as such in the test procedure. Basically, say for example, your scenario itself will contain the link to the test cases that you are going to execute as part of that particular procedure or scenario. Okay, the next thing that you do in the test implementation is who in your team is going to execute what test cases, right? So even the schedule is being identified when the test execution is going to start, and who is going to execute what test cases in your testing team. All of that is also part of the test implementation, right? So as I explained previously, in the whole process, all three steps are very, very important, and test implementation is more of grouping things together, grouping test cases together, forming the test suite, forming the overall scenario, combining the test cases together to formulate a complete business flow or testing the business flow, and then also identifying the execution schedule and who is going to execute those test cases, right? Now moving on to the next question, which is basically what are some of the test design technique or test case design technique, right? So test case design technique are very, very important techniques because every tester needs to understand these and apply these when you are working in any of the testing projects. So test design technique, there are mainly three categories: specification based or black box testing technique, okay, structure based or white box testing techniques, and then experience based testing technique. So these are mainly high level three categories of test case design technique, and within these there are many other test design techniques that are applied, which we'll cover in upcoming questions as well, right? So if somebody asks what are some of the test design technique, you can basically categorize them into these three categories, okay? Now, what is 73rd question? What is specification based or black box test design technique? Okay. So specification based or black box test design technique, which is basically one of the three categories, right? So when we say black box test design technique, as we have understood about the black box testing, that means you are more bothered about the functionality, right? So functional aspect of it, or you do not want to worry about the internal working of the code, right? So specification based or black box test design technique, you are applying the testing technique and you are not concerned about the internal software structure, how the communication happens between methods, functions, etc. So that you are not worried about at all. Black box test design technique or specification based testing technique is a dynamic testing technique, right? And in this, the tester is concerned what the software does and not how it does. Okay, so what exactly the software does and not how it does. You test both functional as well as non-functional characteristics in black box test design technique. So the next question is around what is structure based or white box test design technique, right? So in the white box test design technique, as opposed to the black box test design technique, in black box testing technique, when you design your test cases, you are just bothered about input output driven, right? Whichever technique you are going to apply in black box testing technique, you will be just bothered about input and output and the functional aspect. In white box or structured based technique, you are worried or you need to also ensure that whichever technique, white box testing technique you are applying, you are making sure that you are testing the internal software structure, how the code is being executed, how many statements have been executed, how many conditions have been exercised when a particular functionality is being executed, right? And in structured based or white box testing technique, you test the conditions, the statements, unit testing, right? So unit testing is basically your white box testing technique, okay? And when there are certain design techniques or certain test case design techniques applied in the unit testing, that is what the white box test design techniques are. And there are many different techniques that we are going to cover in black box specifically, because that's relevant for the testers. So there is equivalence, partitioning, boundary value analysis. That's all black box testing or black box test design technique. In white box testing technique, there are many other techniques as well. So because unit testing or the structure based or white box testing technique is not very much relevant to the testers, so we are not going to cover in detail what all test design techniques can be applied. But there are, if you are preparing for ISTQB certification, there are many white box test design techniques that will be in the syllabus as well. Okay, now any of the white box testing or white box test design technique will require good understanding of code structure and programming knowledge, because it's the unit testing, right? So you need to get into the detail internal working structure and understand the logic and code in order to do white box testing using white box test design techniques. Okay. Now the next question, which is basically what is experience based testing technique? So experience based testing technique is basically comes from the experience of the user or the tester, right? So in experience based testing technique, knowledge of testers, developers, any other stakeholders, existing knowledge is being used to design the test cases and conditions, and experiences of both technical people and business people is considered when experience based testing technique is applied. Not always all of these structured white box, black box, equivalence, partitioning, boundary value analysis is going to help in all the cases. There are many flows which are the business flows wherein you have to have the knowledge and the experience of that particular application, domain, system, and then come up with the scenarios that are actually going to be useful and helpful for the end user, how the end user is going to use the particular system. So that's where experience of the existing users, testers, developers comes in picture, and based on that experience people come up with the scenarios. And whenever the experience is being applied to design the test cases and develop the test cases, those techniques are known as experience based testing techniques. Okay. The next question is, what is equivalence partitioning? So equivalence partitioning is one of the black box test design technique, right? So we have understood about what is black box test design, what are black box test design technique, right? So equivalence partition is one of the black box test design technique, and it can be applied at all levels of testing, right? So equivalence partitioning. So there is a word equivalence and then there is a partition word, right? So equivalence partition, the idea behind it, say for example, you have a text box on a particular website that you want to test against, right? So just a simple, very simple example. And that text box only accepts the values, only numbers 1 to 10, right? So if I have to ask how many partitions or valid and invalid partitions are possible, then if I talk about the valid partition, it will be 1 to 10 because that particular text box only accepts the numbers 1 to 10. So that's the valid partition, right? And then invalid partition is anything less than 10, less than 1, okay? And anything more than 10. So those two are the invalid partition, right? And any random number, that is basically, exploratory, that comes into the exploratory testing. But in terms of partition, because this is a text box that only accepts 1 to 10 numbers, so 1 to 10 is the valid partition, right? And then there are two invalid partition, which are one is above 10 and another one is below 1, right? So when you have any such scenarios wherein you can think that yes, I can partition these, there is a logical acceptance of the values in this particular text box, or there is a logical calculation that happens that if the purchase amount is 500, this percent discount. If it is more than 500 and less than 1000, this percentage discount. So you can apply this partition technique to come up with the test scenarios, right? Test conditions. Okay. So what the idea behind equivalence partition is, now we have a text box which accepts only 1 to 10 numbers. So we have 3 partitions, 2 invalid and 1 valid. So instead of testing everything randomly, now we can test 1 value in each partition, and that will most probably give you good coverage. Why? Because it is assumed that if one value in a partition behaves in a proper way, then all other values are going to behave in a proper way as well. Now these conditions are true most of the time, but not always, right? And that is where you need to also come up with more scenarios if required. Okay. But most of the time, this equivalence class partition or equivalence class or equivalence partitioning will help you to achieve any of this testing, right? So that's what equivalence partitioning is all about. Now moving on to the 77th question, what is boundary value analysis? Now boundary value analysis is again a black box test design technique, right? It's not a white box, it's a black box test design technique. And in the boundary value, the edge of the partition, the equivalence partition that you have done, right? So the edge of those partitions is taken as a test case or as a test condition. For example, a text box accepts numbers 1 to 10 10, and then there are invalid partition which is less than 1 and more than 10. Okay, so in the boundary value analysis, you pick a condition at the boundary of each of these partition that you have created, right? So a boundary of valid partition is 1, which is the lower boundary, and 10, which is the upper boundary. And then more than 10 is 11, because this text box only accepts the integers. So more than 10 is 11, which is from the upper boundary, right? Upper invalid boundary. And then the lower invalid boundary is 0, which is less than 1. So 0, 1, 10 and 11 make the conditions to test this particular text box, which accepts only 1 to 10 number. This is just a very simple example. You can correlate the same thing with the real testing and real applications whenever you come across, right? I have created a detailed explanation on equivalence, partitioning, boundary value analysis. Recently, I have posted a complete manual testing series, so you can go ahead and watch that as well to get more insights into boundary value analysis and equivalence partition. Now, it is a black box test design technique where test cases are designed using boundary value analysis, and it is used in range checking. To apply BVA, you need to take maximum and minimum values from valid partition together with first or last value respectively in each of the invalid partition adjacent to the valid partition, which I have already explained, right? So this is just a text you can read later. Now the next question, which is 78th question, why both equivalence partition and boundary value analysis are required together? The reason being, any one of this technique doesn't provide you the absolute full coverage, right? So you have created the partitions first, and then you pick a value within those partitions, one from valid partition, say for example, one from invalid, okay, and one from upper invalid boundary. Now you haven't tested any of the boundaries as such, right? So that is why when you create equivalence partition, then you also pick the edge cases of these boundaries or these partitions, and that is why both equivalence partitioning as well as picking the test cases, test conditions from the boundaries of these partitions is important, and that is why both equivalence partitioning and boundary value analysis are required together. Okay, so that is all the text here. Basically, it is important to test some values between the partitions as well, and it is important to test the boundary values as well, right? So something in between and the boundary of the valid and invalid partition is required. The testing should cover all of it, and that is why both EP and BVA are required together, okay, to get the absolute good coverage. Now moving on to the next question, which is 79th question. What is decision table testing? So decision table testing shows different combination of input with their associated output, right? And this is also known as cause effect table. So if somebody says, can you explain what is cause effect table or decision table decision table testing? So that decision table and cause effect table are the same thing. Okay. Now in the decision table, what exactly you perform is, say for example, based on certain conditions. So if I select 400,000 as the loan amount, okay, $400,000 as a loan amount, and tenure as 30 years, and interest rate as 5%, okay, then all the valid inputs are selected. What should be the outcome? You should get the calculation of the EMIs. Okay, if you choose any of the, if you miss any of these values, say for example, you miss the interest and you chosen the $400,000 loan amount and the duration, but you miss the interest, then it should give you a error message that you have to choose the interest rate as well, right? So based on the input conditions that you choose, the output is determined. Any scenario wherein you have this sort of logic, wherein you have some input and based on the input output is determined, you can apply decision table testing, right? So decision table testing is when you apply the combination of input and the output is determined based on the combination of input. You can apply the decision table testing to test those scenarios, and decision table testing is used to test different combination of input resulting in different actions, right? So decision table testing is used if different combinations are resulting in different output, and decision table testing provides a systematic way of stating complex business rule, which makes it very helpful, right? So any complex business rule can be stated very simply using decision table testing, because you have certain input conditions, and when you choose certain input condition, the output is determined. If some condition changes, it will be a different outcome. If some other condition changes, it should be a different outcome, right? So you create a sort of an Excel. It looks like an Excel table with different conditions you specify on one side, okay, as an input. And when an input changes, what output should be available, or what should be the output in that case. That's how you keep a track of your test cases using decision table. Okay, so now what is the last question of this particular part 8? What is state transition testing? Now, state transition testing is also a black box test design technique, and in state transition testing, a system or a application, right? So any application in software has certain states. For example, if I take an ATM example, right? So ATM machine initially, until you insert a card, is in ready state, right? As soon as you insert the card is being accepted. The software reads the card details and the execution happens, and the software identifies, yeah, this is the valid bank card, and then it will ask for the PIN. Okay, so it will prompt for the PIN. So the state of the ATM software or the ATM machine is no more in the ready state. It has changed to the prompting for the PIN, right? So whenever you are testing the application or the software wherein you are testing the different state and the flow of states in the application, in the software, that is state transition testing. An ATM example, banking, internet banking website example is one of the simplest and best example to put through the state transition testing. When somebody asks what is state transition testing, you can pick the ATM example that any software will have different states, and when the testing is being done to ensure the software state, or to ensure that the business flow, when you are testing the business flow, that makes the software states to move from one state to another state. Any transition that is basically triggering software state to move from one state to another state, when you apply those sort of transition and the state techniques, that is what state transition testing is. And any application wherein, for example, you have this ATM machine, you have the internet banking, right, or you have the e-commerce website, right? So initially, when you launch an e-commerce website, it's in ready state. You are not logged in. It's a different state. When you log in, okay, when you put username and password and click on login, now the state is that you are on the home page. Okay, so this state transition testing helps you to test the flow of different states in a particular application, and not single testing technique or single black box test design technique is good enough. You need to use the combination of all of the techniques that are there available to design your test cases to get the best possible coverage and ensure that the testing coverage or testing covers the best possible scenario and ensures the quality of your software and application is good to be released, right? So that's all for this particular part 8 of manual testing interview questions. If you want to get into more detail and learn more detail with example of all of these black box test design techniques, I highly recommend going through the manual testing series that I have recently posted. I'll put the link as well, so go through that. If you're not able to find, just browse through my channel. There are a lot of videos and a playlist you can go through and browse. You'll easily be able to find that. In that, all of these black box test design techniques are covered in much more detail with examples, so it will be very easy for you to explain in any interviews. Even on the whiteboard you can go ahead and draw and explain. Okay, so that's all for this video. In the next video of manual testing interview question, I'll cover another 10 important manual testing interview questions and answers with examples. So I hope this was helpful. Thank you very much for watching.